I was also studying Hegel and Hegelian dialectics in college, and how that's and he does say that there's thesis, antithesis, synthesis. There's a good academic research which I think demonstrates that Hegel was also influenced by Kabbalistic ideas. So you have the two pillars of mercy and severity, and then you have the synthesis of those two extremes that can be a way of managing and controlling. And people have got this down to a science. It's not just my speculation. You can read like global elite writers like Jacques Attali. He'll talk about Cold War being two pillars of two sides of the dialectic, that you sort of manage the middle ground and you can synthesize and bring them together.
This is Hegel's drawing of how the dialectic of the synthesis works, and you can see that it is an actual occult drawing, right? So it's like triangles on top of triangles on top of triangles, right? This is the dialectical process of thesis, antithesis producing the synthesis. And people have tried to argue with me over the years that that's not what Hegel says. He don't really teach that. No, Hegelian philosophers show that is what he says, and that is what I had Hegel classes, and all my professors told me that that's what Hegel teaches. And I'm talking about people who studied under Marxist Hegelians. So again, none of these people. So internet goobers that are 20 years old know more than the PhDs in Hegel. My undergrad professor wrote his thesis on Hegel and Marx. So my advisor studied under the guy who studied under Habermas, writes his PhD thesis on Hegel. I think he would know what Hegel teaches. All right. So there you see the triadic thesis structure, and note that this has nothing to do with the Christian Trinity. It's another example of why you can't do thesis and why you can't do a word concept fallacy here, because Hegel says, "Well, I believe in the Trinity," and then you ask Hegel what the Trinity is, and it's thesis, antithesis, synthesis, right? I mean, Hegel's Trinity is immanentized into the world historical process. Okay, that's Hegel's Trinity. God is the absolute of all historical process in Hegel. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis, moving to the omega point, moving to the absolute, where everything becomes absolute spirit. So let's look at some of these figures that influenced Hegel, and we're going to understand why this is such a weird esoteric philosophy. By the way, if you want to support the show, you can via the Super Chat function right there. Super Chats are done via Streamlabs. And I'm giving you the whole historical, ideological drift, the background to understanding Marxism and socialism, which cannot be understood without understanding first Hegel, Hegel's influences, and then the Hermetic and ancient Hellenic pre-Socratic influences. There's really, literally no other way to understand Marxism. And of course, none of the other, like when libertarians are out there critiquing, not every libertarian. I think Dr. James Lindsay does have a good basic idea of what we're talking about today. He's correct. But most of the libertarian response to Marxism is super low tier. They don't know any of this stuff. Because if they did know this, they would know that their philosophy is also part of that dialectic. So again, the key here is rejecting of all the dialectics. And every time I say that, people have no idea what I'm talking about. They're just lost. It's like, what does that mean? What do you mean? So here we have, so I don't believe that money is evil, right? The love of money is evil, not money. So you can get out of here. Don't have any interest in talking to you. If you want to support the show, you can via Streamlabs. So again, thank you for the super chats that we got last night. We got one so far. So I'll read those perhaps here in a bit. So in Dr. McGee's text, he goes into the historical influences on Hegel from the esoteric tradition. And we're going to name some of these figures. The first, he calls the early Hermeticists that had an influence, such as the Neoplatonic philosophers. Hegel admired Proclus quite a bit, so he was influenced by Neoplatonic philosophy. I think that's pretty obvious, pretty well known. Another famous mystic from that time period was Meister Eckhart. Eckhart was a mystic in Gotha about 1260. He died in 1327. No one has demonstrated the direct Hermetic influence on Eckhart, but his thought exhibits certainly Hermetic influences co-opted out of German Hermeticists in later times. Eckhart's significance for German philosophy and intellectual culture cannot be overestimated. In fact, Eckhart dominates for many centuries German mystical philosophy afterwards, and certainly the apophatic and I would argue that Eckhart's a manifestation of Roman Catholic theological inadequacies of that time, because you'll notice that it's a Trinitarian heresy in Eckhart. Eckhart preached that just as the Son requires the Father to give him existence, so the Father is not Father without the Son. Thus, God would not be God without the created order. So we have the problem of modal collapse and the notion of creation as a necessity and not ex nihilo. That always results out of absolute divine simplicity problems in the West. So filioque, which is again the mystical filioque of Plotinus's Aeneads is what underlies Eckhart. God would not be God without creation. God must create to actualize who he is. This is actually an Aristotelian argument. This is why Basil calls Aristotle a dyad heretic. This is one of the most innovative of Eckhart's Hermetica. Just as in Hegel, more than 500 years later, God the Father is conceived of as an abstract and incomplete. The nature or creation is the Son. The Son is an emanation that returns to the Father, and thus the Holy Spirit, as in Hegel, is mankind. So again, what is Hegelianism? Immanentized pantheism. It's Neoplatonism pantheized. Nicholas of Cusa, again the famous Hermeticist, who on the basis of the filioque argued that there was an internal process philosophy going on in God. And Nicholas of Cusa, by the way, influences not just German idealism, but also Leibniz's monads. Creation is a necessity in Nicholas of Cusa because Nicholas of Cusa identifies nature and person, much the same way that people like Aquinas do. Now, wait a minute. You're lying. Aquinas believes in creation ex nihilo. Yeah, that's called a contradiction. So, collapsing nature into person, collapsing will and energy into essence, and then saying that you believe in creation ex nihilo does not believe that you consistently believe it. Does not mean you consistently believe in it. It just means you contradict. Other Renaissance Neoplatonists had a tremendous influence on Hegel, particularly Jacob Boehme, and the overlaps with Kabbalism. Pico della Mirandola, Johann Reuchlin, Cornelius Agrippa, who was a famous Renaissance magus, and Giordano Bruno, all have a tremendous influence on the figure of Hegel and his process philosophy. For Boehme and many of these characters, logos is not the second person of the Godhead. As with Gnostic conceptions of the logos, Jacob Boehme's wisdom or logos is conceived of as an active. It is the source of the further specifications of God's corporeality. For Boehme, God's wisdom or logos is conceived of as female. It's metaphorically female. So here we have Sophia Philosophia Bulgakov already in Jacob Boehme, which is also heterodox. And wisdom is personified as a female in Proverbs and then identified as the logos, the second person of the Godhead in John. So it's an analogy. It doesn't mean that God is literally a woman or that the logos is a woman or that there's some other person in the Trinity known as Sophia or this quasi-Trinitarian This is all Hermeticism, right? So when you see the Hermetic philosophy, you can see that Bulgakov is just regurgitating Hermetic philosophy. So Rosicrucianism and Freemasonry are becoming very popular also at the time of Hegel's academic career. Three works modestly proposed the general reformation of the entire world. The Rosicrucian Manifesto centered around the legendary figure of Christian Rosenkreuz, who was supposed to have been born in 1378 and taught the Hermetic arts by the Arabs, and then died in 1484. The Rosicrucian writings contain, in the words of scholar Antoine Favre, traces of Kabbalah, Pythagoreanism, and Paracelsusm. The Rosicrucian manifestos then would influence Hegel, I presume, at his when he was an academic. Hegelian philosophy also is similar to Freemasonic philosophy because, as I showed, I think I put this up on Twitter several months ago. If you look at Albert Pike's account of what the Trinity and the generation of the Son is, it's the same as these Hermetic ones. And I found this by going and reading the entire chapter that Albert Pike has on the Church Fathers. Believe it or not, Albert Pike has a chapter on the Church Fathers in Morals and Dogma. And the amazing thing that I did not expect was Pike's conclusion at the end of that chapter is that Origen and Neoplatonism are the true Christianity. Isn't that wild? Let me see if I can find that. Dang it, it never comes up when I want it. Used to, you could search, maybe I should search X. No, it's not going to come up. Used to, you could search, oh, here it is. Huh, amazing. Yeah, it came up. And I'll reshare this on Twitter in case people want to go see it. But so this is Morals and Dogma of Albert Pike, kind of summarizing. It's like the systematic theology or systematic philosophy of Scottish Rite Freemasonry. And I'm just showing that it says and it aligns with what we've been reading so far in these treatises to show a commonality between Neoplatonism, Gnosticism, which Albert Pike tries to synthesize all these, right? And he says that the true Christianity is a generic first cause, and he makes an Aristotelian argument there, of a necessary creation from the one of Plato that is an emanation. And then he says, so the eternal world is necessary because God is an eternal creator. He makes Origen's argument. This is Albert Pike, Morals and Dogma, page 575. And as the thought of the soul emanating from the soul becomes audible and visible in words, so did the thought of God, the Logos, springing up within himself, immortal as himself, when once he conceived, immortal before, because in himself, utter in himself was the Word, the Logos. Its manifestation and mode of communication thus create material, mental, spiritual universe, which, like him, never began to exist. The world is an eternal emanation that is synonymous with the eternal begetting of the Son. This is the real idea of the ancient nations. Generic God, the Almighty Father and the source of all, and his thought, conceiving the universe and willing its creation, because it is just as necessary as his essence. That is a modal collapse argument in Albert Pike, the same argument that Origen makes for eternal worlds. Because if God is eternal God, an eternal Father, an eternal Creator, there must be eternal world of which he is provident Lord and Creator. And that world is the Son or the Logos. So you have the collapsing of the persons of the Godhead into the immanent process of the world. God is world process. The Logos is the world historical world process. Exactly what Hegel says. So I don't know for sure if Hegel was in some lodge. If he was, it'll be in Terry Melanson's excellent book, which is, I think, is to date probably the most scholarly work on the 17th century Bavarian Illuminati. So if you don't have Perfectibilis, it's by my publisher. I recommend getting Perfectibilis. I don't have the text with me, so I can't remember or look up if Hegel was in it. But I know that the King of Prussia was a Freemason. And many of the circles of the Prussian elite were totally involved in the philosophy of the Lodge, which, as you can see from Pike, is essentially a kind of Origenism / pantheism / Neoplatonism. So now that we come up to Hegel, we can understand, as you see here, Hegel's lectures on the history of philosophy. He gives quite a space here to Heraclitus. I'm not going to reread all this because a lot of this is what you heard me explaining about Heraclitus. But why am I showing you this? Well, which website has this? Did you happen?